The Warriors lost their fifth of six Summer League games on Thursday against the Houston Rockets, a 118-101 defeat, but it did signal the debut of 57th overall pick Trayce Jackson-Davis. I'm going to dive into his performance on this episode, along with a couple of other takeaways from Summer League and what the Warriors are planning to do with their 14th roster spot. Yes, welcome to another episode of the Golden State with Mates podcast. As I said in the intro, a disappointing defeat for the Golden State Warriors today, going down 118-101 to the Houston Rockets. Look, it's Summer League. The team results, the win-loss aspect of it means very little. They are 1-5 though, which is disappointing. And would we like to see more positive winning impact by some of these players throughout Summer League? Absolutely, but it's not the be-all and end-all at the end of the day. We are here to focus on specific players, and one of those we got to see for the first time today was Trayce Jackson-Davis. If you're a Warrior fan, I don't think you could have asked for much more from TJD, to be honest, in his debut. 14 points, 7 rebounds, an assist, a block shot, couple of turnovers. Look, a little bit rusty early, but I think all in all, an exciting performance from the 57th overall pick. A couple of takeaways from Trayce Jackson-Davis today. He's 6'9", obviously. He's been kind of linked as a power forward / center coming into the NBA. I think we can shelve the idea of him being a power forward, especially in a Steve Kerr-led Warriors system. I don't think that's a position he'll be playing whatsoever, because with his size, he's 6'9", he plays big. He plays at that size, if not bigger. It's almost like a Kevon Looney situation where we saw Loon have rebound after rebound, 20 rebounds in Game 7 against the Sacramento Kings in that first round series. And I often have to remind some of my mates that, hey, Kevon Looney's only 6'9". He plays like he's a 7-footer, but he's only 6'9". And I think you get 6'9" guys who are lean, who are a little bit more athletic maybe, who are 3-4s rather than centers. But Trayce Jackson-Davis is not one of those guys. He's a genuine 6'9", big body, nice frame, good athleticism still though. And I don't think we'll be seeing him play power forward at all. Actually, when I first saw him on the floor wearing that number 32 jersey, potentially made famous by Otto Porter Jr. most recently, but I actually got some flashbacks to a bit of Marquise Chris, and a lot of people might be saying, well, I hope we've got more in Trayce Jackson-Davis than what we did in Marquise Chris. I did think that Marquise Chris was a pretty solid player for the Warriors throughout his short stint. It was probably the best part of his career, best stint of his career was with the Warriors as opposed to any other team who, as a top 10 pick, let's be honest, he was a bust. But I think with that frame, with the size, kind of bigger build at 6'9" still, and with the kind of athleticism, the pick and roll attributes, the dunker spot, the finishing with the two-hand slam, and again, it might have just been more so wearing that 32 jersey of the Warriors. I did get some Marquise Chris flashbacks. That's not to say that Trayce Jackson-Davis can't be a better NBA player than Marquise Chris was. I think there's a bit more feel and passing to his game than Marquise Chris would have ever had, if I'm being honest. We know that's an element that Mike Dunleavy Jr. alluded to the other day in his press conference about the Warriors needing another big. He said, well, we don't just want a big guy for the sake of a big guy. We need them to be skilled. We need them to have a feel for the game. And I think that's what Trayce Jackson-Davis can provide. His very first play, very impressive, kind of darted from the perimeter inside, received the ball, drew 2 defenders, and found a cutting Guy Santos from the baseline. Very exciting. In fact, of all the things he did today, that might have been the best, and it was on the very first play, just in terms of being able to read the defense and find the cutter in that scenario, as opposed to these less skilled centers who can often go searching for their shot first and foremost, and especially in a situation like that for Trayce Jackson-Davis, who has been dealing with a hamstring injury, who is yet to play in Summer League until today. He would have been itching to get at it, and in that scenario, you might not have blamed him for potentially rushing things, for putting up a baby hook or something like that to try and get on the board points-wise. was a really nice find to Guy Santos, and I think that shows an intriguing element that hopefully can move forward with the Warriors next season and in years to come. The rest of the game was more about his scoring elements. Obviously, 14 points, a number of two-hand slams. I thought the connection between him and Brandon Podziemski, who I'm going to speak about in a minute, was really nice and encouraging for Warrior fans. There are a lot of times where Podziemski was able to get into the paint, where Trayce Jackson-Davis was playing in the dunker spot, and Podziemski was able to find him for the two-hand slam. Bit rusty early on, missed a couple of layups that he really should have made. They were point-blank ones. But otherwise, a really encouraging performance from Trayce Jackson-Davis. It's going to be interesting to me because obviously that's his first game, but from what I take from that is that if you are looking at these two Warrior rookies in Podziemski and Jackson-Davis, and you're looking at who could make more of an impact straight away, I think it's actually Jackson-Davis. And that's a bit surprising to say, maybe the 57th overall pick late in the draft as opposed to a first-round pick just outside of the lottery. I'm not saying it from a perspective of Trayce Jackson-Davis is 23 years old compared to 20 in Podziemski. I'm actually just saying it from what the Warriors need next season, and their lack of size and their lack of front court options on the roster means that Jackson-Davis is going to have a lot more opportunity for minutes next season than what I envisage for Podziemski. And also looking at Podziemski's summer league so far, which we'll get into a second. But there is a really intriguing element here with Jackson-Davis as a potential pick and roll partner for Chris Paul. Now, I said on the podcast earlier in the week that I'm not sure about the Warriors trying to dive into two different offensive styles, one with Chris Paul on the floor and one with Chris Paul off the floor. I think there needs to be a meshing of the two. That may not necessarily be the case, though, because on their latest podcast, Anthony Slater mentioned how the Warriors are kind of embracing will be embracing more of a pick and roll style with Chris Paul there. And so if that's the case, then someone like Trayce Jackson-Davis, who is a very good pick and roll player, who can not only finish around the rim in pick and roll situations, but also, as I said before, has that kind of passing element to his game where he could, if defenses collapse, he could kick out to a shooter or find another cutter kind of thing. I think that's going to be very interesting, and I am super intrigued to see how Trayce Jackson-Davis could go. I know Slater in an article earlier in the week as well said, don't discount Jackson-Davis from potentially having a role with the Warriors next season. I don't think we'll be seeing him on a completely nightly basis, game to game, but I do think that we could see him at certain stints, especially if any of the other front court players like a Draymond or a Loon or a Dario Saric, if any of those three guys get an injury, then all of a sudden there's not really many other options left, and Jackson-Davis might be thrown into the mix out of necessity more than anything. But I do think that he could thrive in a limited role next season for 10 minutes here or there every couple of games, where perhaps he plays with Chris Paul, maybe Saric is playing as the 4, a couple other shooters out on the floor, and he could excel as just diving to the rim, playing in the dunker spot, whatever it is. I do think there is some exciting attributes that he could bring to the Warriors from as early as next season. We'll get on to Brandon Podziemski, who had another quietish game today. I mean, he's a little bit better, 10 points, 2 rebounds, 6 assists. Came off a couple of games earlier in the week. I spoke about his game against the Pelicans where he was 3 for 16 from the field, but then he had a 1 for 10 shooting performance yesterday, actually. 4 for 8 today, a little bit better. Look, the playmaking and the court vision here is absolutely elite. He kind of projected as this combo guard, maybe even more of a 2 guard. He's a flat-out point guard to me right now. His ability to, and I spoke about this the other day, he doesn't have a quick first step at all. Athletically, he can't necessarily get by guys, but he can get into the paint. He's kind of shifty in that way where he can get into the paint, draw defenders and find teammates, whether that was Jackson-Davis in the dunker spot, whether it's perimeter shooters outside the arc. I think he does an excellent job of being able to find teammates and orchestrate passes accordingly. It actually makes me think, like, I was really big on the Corey Joseph signing just as a third string point guard, because obviously you've got a 38-year-old Chris Paul, a 35-year-old Stephen Curry next season. Those couple of guys are we going to see them play more than 65 games next year? Probably not. So I thought a third string point guard was a real need for the Warriors. They addressed that in Corey Joseph. I do think moving forward, though, let's say we have Curry and Paul back on the roster in 2024-25. Now, that's a big question mark with Chris Paul, his contractual situation, whatever else. But hypothetically speaking, let's say that things go really well and Chris Paul is on the roster heading into the following season, then maybe you don't actually need a third point guard in that situation, because you'll have Brandon Podziemski, who I'm now evaluating as more of a point guard than anything else. His ability to handle the ball and make plays, I think, has really excelled so far in Summer League. His individual scoring has been less of a factor, obviously, and his shooting, he doesn't see it as too much of a major issue. He tweeted out after yesterday's game where he went 1 for 10 that, he wasn't too concerned, wasn't too worried, that he's been putting the work in and it'll eventually come round and his shots will start to fall. Look, is it a speed thing? Is he finding that coming out of the college system now into the Summer League that guys are closing out to him just a fraction more, that there's a bit more length and athleticism out there that he can't quite combat, and therefore he's rushing shots a little bit? Potentially so. And a lot of people would think, well, that's an issue because it's only going to get worse in the NBA. There's going to be more length out there. There's going to be more athleticism. The speed's going to be greater. I actually see it the other way, where if he's to get minutes with the Warriors next season, which I think is unlikely, as I said before, I think Jackson-Davis is more likely to get more regular opportunities than Podziemski. But if he does, I wouldn't say that his shooting percentages are going to be at the level where we're seeing in Summer League. I think they'll actually be better. More so because he won't be taking the kind of volume of shots and the difficulty of shots that he is with this Warriors team in Summer League. It'll be more catch and shoot attempts. It'll be off the ball rather than on the ball. You won't see as much of the playmaking because he probably won't be asked to put the ball on the floor necessarily a whole lot and try and attack the paint. So that'll be interesting to see. But I just think that with Steph Curry, with Chris Paul, with Corey Joseph, with Draymond as a playmaker as well, I just don't think the Warriors necessarily need the kind of playmaking, ball handling attributes that Brandon Podziemski brings, as opposed to someone like Jackson-Davis, who they could actually do with his size in a potential pick and roll combination with a Chris Paul or something like that. The other thing for Podziemski today, big thing at the draft, Cam Whitmore, who was a projected top 10 pick, slid all the way to the Warriors at 19. They had access to him. I was on Twitter throughout that draft, and the amount of Warrior fans that were screaming basically on Twitter, take Whitmore, take Whitmore, take Whitmore. Athletic, hybrid, wing forward. And the Warriors passed on him and took Podziemski, and the Rockets took him with pick 20. So they come up against the Rockets today, and in terms of the early evaluation on that kind of Podziemski-Whitmore comparison, not a good start for Podziemski and the Warriors, let's put it that way. Cam Whitmore had his hands all over this game. 26 points, 11 for 21 shooting, 5 rebounds, and 8 steals. 8 steals today. Was probably the best player on the floor. So that comparison between those two players, with the Warriors potentially having access, well, not potentially, they did have access to Whitmore in the draft and chose not to take him. Just in terms of that, I do think that the non-selection of Cam Whitmore was more a signal that the Warriors plan on keeping Jonathan Kuminga around long-term. I do think that having Kuminga and Whitmore, two similar project-y type of players, would have overlapped and probably would have been too much of a stretch for the Warriors to try and develop both players into a similar role. So I do think that signaled to me that, okay, they've got one guy here who is super athletic, who is really talented, who they want to try and develop, and that's Jonathan Kuminga, and he's not going anywhere, as opposed to bringing Whitmore in, having both of them, and trying to kind of develop both players, as I said, in a similar role. And that could have been a potential sign of the Warriors wanting to move Kuminga this offseason and kind of putting Whitmore into his role as someone who might take a couple of years to find a rotation role. Now, obviously, Kuminga is coming into his third season now, and I'm really high on his ability to be able to contribute come the regular season and into the playoffs next year. Obviously, he had a really impressive regular season in 2022-23, 20 minutes a game. Looked fantastic, one of the most exciting elements of the Warriors season. And hopefully he can build on that rather than the postseason, obviously, where he was axed from the rotation and was stapled to the bench, basically. But I do think that the Whitmore non-selection kind of does signal Kuminga being a part of this franchise moving forward. I do also think that the Warriors simply saw Podziemski as a guy that is a Warrior-style player who is not going to take a couple of years to develop, who has a feel for the game in terms of a quick decision maker. Obviously, his passing ability, which we spoke about at length. I do think that they probably thought, look, does Podziemski have the upside of Whitmore? No, probably not. Whitmore could probably turn into an all-star in this league. But if we can get a rotational piece from year 2 who can be a good, solid player for us in the long term, that's probably worth it over a guy who might be an all-star at his best, but might also never be a rotation piece. And if he is, it's probably going to take to year 3 kind of thing. So I think that was they've clearly shown, I think, in this offseason that they're more willing to go with the safer options, I think, over the risky high upside but low floor kind of players. And we saw that in the draft with Podziemski and Whitmore, and we saw it with the fact they dealt Jordan Poole for Chris Paul, a turbulent, up and down young guard who's explosive, yes, but also has moments of absolute chaos, compared to just a really steady veteran 18 years into his career, the point god, who might not be as good in year 2 and 3, but for straight away, he's going to bring a steadiness to the Warriors that they need. Anyway, we'll take a break, and next up, we'll get into the Warriors and their 14th roster spot and what we may see there. So the Dario Saric signing became official a couple of days ago. I spoke about that on a podcast earlier in the week. Go check that out if you haven't already, or on YouTube. Great pickup. That means 13 contracted players so far for next season. 2 roster spots available, plus obviously the 2-way deal. So what are we going to see here for the 14th roster spot? I think the Warriors are in absolutely no rush. That's a fact. I think the guys that are available on the market that could potentially be available for minimum deals, I don't think anyone really stands out. Let's have a look at a couple of the options. So if you want the high upside guys, the actually really talented basketball players who could make a major difference if things go well, Christian Wood is clearly numero uno on the free agent market right now. If the Warriors want someone who is a very talented offensive player and who fits a need as a center, there's no doubt about that. And I think a lot of Warrior fans would be excited if we woke up tomorrow and Christian Wood was signed to the Golden State Warriors on a minimum contract. That would be a steal on a minimum deal. I'm surprised he's still around on the free agent market. I'm surprised that he hasn't been offered anything over a minimum. So theoretically right now, Christian Wood is gettable for the Warriors on a minimum deal, if he's willing to take that, obviously, which at this point might be all he's able to get. However, I remember a few years ago when Christian Wood left the Pistons for the Rockets on that 3-year, $27 million deal, and I thought it was one of the biggest steals of that free agency. I thought it was a magnificent move from the Houston Rockets. I really like Christian Wood's game early on. However, you get to a point where everything you do individually as a scorer gets put into context of how much are you actually impacting your team here? How much are you actually increasing the winning chances of your team in particular games and across the course of the season? And what do you do outside of putting the ball in the basket? And Andre Drummond had a really good quote the other day, basically talking about that, you know, if you're a center and you're a bench piece, it's not necessarily about your points and your rebounds. It's about your cultural impact with the team. and him going from a $100 million guy to a minimum contract and really having to try and buy into, hey, I'm not that player anymore. I need to be a really good cultural fit. I need to be a good teammate. All the off-the-court things. And then obviously once you get on the court, putting in as much as you can, not only on the offensive end, but the defensive end as well. And that's obviously where Christian Wood has really struggled. I do think that Christian Wood's defensive limitations would be mitigated somewhat by the fact that he could play next to Draymond Green and Andrew Wiggins, like a front court of Wiggins, Green, Christian Wood. I like the idea of that to an element, and I do think that that would limit the defensive weaknesses that we see from Christian Wood. However, just the cultural fit of, bringing in a guy who is probably would like to play 25, 30 minutes a game and who is realistically, when you've got Looney and when you've got Saric and Green as more small ball options, Christian Wood's playing anywhere between 10 and 20 minutes, maybe. And we've seen that he's had an issue with his playing time, and there has been some off-court issues there in terms of the lack of opportunity that he's got, with the Mavericks most recently, where he put up good numbers, don't get me wrong. He's a talented offensive player. There is no doubt about that. But I just think this Warrior system, this Warrior culture that they're trying to recapture after a poor 2022-23 season, I don't think that Christian Wood necessarily fits into that. I wouldn't be totally against it if they went and signed him. However, I don't think I'd be as excited as other Warrior fans who simply see, 16 points a game last season. A very talented offensive player. There's no doubt about that. But the other factors at play here, I don't think fit in to what the Warriors are trying to build. The other player as well, a guy that we've seen in the Bay playing for Golden State, Kelly Oubre Jr. Now, we've seen this before, and it didn't really work out too well, did it? I mean, again, another guy who put up numbers. He averaged over 20 points a game last season, which is wild, although it was the Charlotte Hornets and on bad teams, someone has to put up numbers. His 1 year with the Warriors, again, put up some points, largely inefficient. His perimeter defense was okay, but maybe it's a little overrated. Look, for a minimum contract, great. Great signing for a minimum contract. But again, for what the Warriors are trying to build, for their culture, it's pretty much the same situation as Christian Wood. Maybe Oubre's defense is a little bit better than Wood, but he's also not really in a position of need at this point. When you bring in Saric, who can kind of play that 4 position, you've got Kuminga there, you've got Wiggins. Moody will probably play the 3 mostly, so I don't think Oubre is a need as much as Wood would be in terms of a positional aspect. They're probably the 2 most talented players left on the free agent market. And then you get to guys that really aren't moving the needle too much and aren't exciting fans. Like, could the Warriors sign Bismack Biyombo as insurance to Looney? And, whenever Looney or Dre or Saric is out, maybe Biyombo gets a few minutes here and there. He's played with Chris Paul before, and Chris Paul actually, for a stretch in Phoenix, made Bismack Biyombo look pretty good and kind of revitalized his career a little bit. Again, if the Warriors sign Bismack Biyombo, I think most fans are going to be like, really? Like Bismack Biyombo, and be pretty unexcited at the prospect of having him. But again, maybe as a guy who does not play at all in the rotation unless Looney or Green are injured, who knows, potentially. But then there's other options like that. Like, do you bring DeMarcus Cousins back from overseas? Do you bring Dwight Howard back from overseas? Those kind of guys who are just big bodies at this point and could be insurance to Kevon Looney. I do think that the Warriors need to sign a big either way, whether that's with the 14th roster spot or as a 2-way deal. And given those options that I've mentioned as a 14th roster spot guy, there's not too many options there apart from Wood that's too exciting. And when I say Wood's exciting, I mean he's intriguing. That's for sure. Like, we don't necessarily know what we're going to get. We could get a lot of good. We could get a lot of bad. There's quite a variance there. I do think they probably need to target one on a 2-way deal, though. And this is where kind of the 14th roster spot comes into play, because if we go back to last season, JaMychal Green, when he signed after being bought out by the Oklahoma City Thunder, he was actually the 13th roster spot. And then, was it 2 weeks before, like early October, where Andre Iguodala was the 14th guy? So we're actually ahead kind of schedule-wise as we were at this point last year. So what we're looking at here is potential buyout guys over the coming months. I know Anthony Slater has been big on Rudy Gay, who's been a target for the Warriors in the past. He's now with the Oklahoma City Thunder. Is he a player that gets bought out? I think there's 18 contracted players with the Thunder right now, so they need to cut a few. Rudy Gay's 35 or 36 years old, one of the two. He's probably on the chopping block here in terms of just a player that doesn't really fit their timeline. Like, why do the Thunder need him? They don't really. So could he be a buyout, or he's waived and becomes a free agent and the Warriors target him? Look, Rudy Gay, not at his best, but before last season was a good option. Yes, don't get me wrong. However, there was some decline last year with the Utah Jazz. I mean, he shot 25% on threes, and I think the big thing for him is he's another one like a Saric, for example, who in the Warriors system is probably, especially at his point of his career, where he's played, I think he's now 16 years into his career, he's probably more of a small ball five. And according to Basketball Reference, he's played 20 and 23% of his last two seasons with the Jazz as a kind of small ball center. So he has experience there. He's played that position before in Utah. But when you've got Draymond, when you've got Saric, I just don't think that Rudy Gay is going to be able to provide the impact that it's necessarily worth, when you could also have a situation where he's playing a little bit and he's taking minutes off of Kuminga, and that's really limiting his opportunity and limiting his development, which is just not what you want at this stage going into year 3 if you're Jonathan Kuminga and if you're the Warriors. And so is it worth, is Rudy Gay going to be worth it? I just don't think the potential output and the impact that he could have is worth the potential of stunted growth in Kuminga and Moody and these other types. So, look, I wouldn't be too concerned if they did sign him. I think it would be okay. But again, are there better options out there? And that's what we're going to be waiting and seeing with, as I said, potentially bought out guys. I think that's what the Warriors are waiting for. Really, they're just waiting to scour the market, especially after a couple of these big trades with Dame and Harden's, those dominoes still to fall. Do some of these veteran players, this is what Slater said on the podcast, do some of these veteran players get moved to a rebuilding team that they don't necessarily need them there, and therefore they get bought out, they get waived, whatever else, and they become available. And that could take a 2-3 month process, and I think you are likely to see, as Siri goes absolutely off on my Apple Watch. Sorry. I think we're going to see a scenario here where the Warriors probably only have 13 contracted players for the next month at least. And then maybe one day randomly there's a signing in the middle of August or the middle of September kind of thing. In terms of the two-way spots, though, because Slater also did mention that there's the chance that they leave the 14th roster spot open and then kind of have a training camp battle, I guess, for that 14th spot, which is what they did a couple of years ago when they had Avery Bradley and Gary Payton II. Look, you got to remember now that there are 3 two-way positions, and I think the Warriors are really well set up here. Quinones, if he's willing and if he accepts the two-way qualifying offer, would be fantastic on a two-way. I do think there's the potential of the Warriors facing some pressure here of either losing him or having to sign him as that 14th roster guy. Guy Santos is another one who I said on the podcast earlier in the week, I think I would like him on a two-way contract. I think that's a really good chance. And then with their third two-way, look, if they're not going to use the 14th roster spot on a center, then I think they definitely need to use their third two-way slot on a center. And there's a couple of options. Omer Yurtseven didn't get a qualifying offer from the Miami Heat, so he's an option that is probably the most talented big man, I would say, that's available as a two-way. A guy that's trying to make it back into the league is Harry Giles III, who was obviously a high-ish pick of the Sacramento Kings. And the other one that I've liked over the last 2 days has really put up his name up in lights over the past 48 hours, and that's Reggie Perry, former Net, former Pacer, former Trailblazer. Played overseas last year. He's playing for the Warriors in summer league at the moment. Had a 20.17 rebound double-double off the bench yesterday in that overtime loss. Did have 9 fouls, so that's not great. The maximum, of course, in summer league is 10. You don't get fouled out after 6. But still, 20 points and 17 rebounds is quite, that's eye-popping. That jumps off the box score sheet quite dramatically. And then today, even, obviously playing behind Jackson-Davis, had 17 and 8 in another 18 minutes. So in terms of the two-way guy who has already been around the Warriors over these past few weeks, maybe he's a guy on a two-way contract that they could bring in. However, again, my biggest point from this is whether it's with the 14th roster spot, whether it is with one of the two-way spots, they do need another center. I'm not necessarily advocating for Christian Wood, but I just think that Kevon Looney has been Iron Man the last two seasons, has not missed a game since the 2021 season. And, I mean, odds would suggest that he's probably going to miss a certain period of time next season. I don't want to wish that on Loon. He's been fantastic. He's a great human being, whatever else. I don't wish that on him or anyone, I should say, for that matter. But the probability is that we could see him out with a slight injury for 5, 10, 15 games. And in that position, what do the Warriors do? I think at this point, you have to kind of imagine, like, it's an 82-game season, for goodness sake. You have to imagine that not everyone is going to be available, and you've got to put in depth pieces to your roster to be able to combat those certain scenarios. And Loon being out for, say, 10, 15 games and asking Draymond to be a full-time center in that period, or asking Saric, or a combination of those two guys to fulfill those center minutes, I think would be unfair in that situation. And so can you bring in a guy on a two-way spot or on that 14th roster spot who can fulfill 10 minutes a night if Kevon Looney was to be out injured? And as unexciting as it is, Bismack Biyombo could come in and play 10, 15 minutes a night if Loon was out for a stretch. He could, right? He's a body. You could put him out there. He's got experience playing next to Chris Paul. Heck, he's got experience playing with Dario Saric as well. Not to try and tell the Warriors to become the Phoenix Suns 2.0 and just grab Paul and Saric and Biyombo and whatever else ex-Suns players you can get your hands on. That's going to be it from me on this episode of the podcast. Give us a follow on Apple Podcasts or Spotify if you can. We are on YouTube as well. This does get uploaded to YouTube as well with shorter clips, so you can subscribe there, like, comment, whatever you like. That would be fantastic. Of course, you can follow me, Peter O'Keefe, at POC252 on Twitter. I'm on Threads as well. I'm not sure if this is ever going to take off. Good luck to Threads. Good luck to Mark Zuckerberg. I'm still primarily on Twitter first and foremost, but yes, I do have a Threads account. If you want to contact me in any way, you can do there. If you want to join in, I'd love to hear your thoughts on the Warriors, on this podcast, whatever else it is. I'd love to hear from you. So looking forward to getting another guest on next week. And until then, enjoy the rest of your week.